All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about attributes and paths. So we've written some basic HTML here with H1s and H2s, but we need to start thinking about like images and links, and then what we actually want to link to and how to link to that. And that's a little bit of a tricky part getting started, so we'll spend some time talking about that. Now we're going to put an image right in the space in between our H1 and our main content area. But we actually need to have an image. If I go to my images folder here, there's nothing in it. There's this DS store, but that's just a Mac thing. So I'm going to open up my box file with the Viscom modules and the JOMC 131 and the Viscom web and the images, right? This is the same images folder. And I'm just going to click and drag and drop a JPEG image, right? So you'll need an image of yourself that's sized correctly. Really the biggest thing we want to think about is we don't want to have a high resolution image here. We want something that shows up relatively small on the screen so that way it'll load faster. Now there's a lot more to that we'll talk about in Web 3 if you continue on with this. But for the most part right now we want to save down our image to a reasonable size is what we'll say. So something that looks something like this, something that doesn't take up the whole screen and you can zoom in and it's super high detailed. So make sure you go into Photoshop or something to like scale it down. And so we do want to move that inside of our images folder, and I would just name it your last name .jpeg. The .jpeg is important. So once we have it in there, you'll notice that it doesn't show up in brackets, and that's fine. It doesn't show up automatically. It will eventually. But if you right click in here and refresh file tree, it's just going to refresh this, and now we have our image in there. So it just doesn't kind of live update. It takes a sec to refresh. Now that's a long way around of we need to have this file to be able to link to it so that way it shows up on our web page. Now if we go into our index file, and under the H1, this is where we're actually going to type in the image tag. So it's an IMG tag, so image. And then an IMG tag by itself is called an empty tag, but that is in itself right there in an image tag. The big thing it's missing is what's called an attribute. And attributes are always the same kind of format. There is a actual attribute and then equals quotes. And inside the quotes is a value, or we're going to type the value to be a path to that image file that we just put there. Now you'll notice that if you're doing this in brackets, you get the little handy hints, so you don't really have to think too hard. You just keep hitting return, and now we have this path to an image that's right here, and this is what's called a relative path, right? So it's relative to the file we're working on. So we're working in the index.html file. It's going to find an images folder, and we know that by a slash. It's going to find an images folder, and inside that images folder, there's a waggler.jpg, right, or whatever your name is. Okay. So this is a little tricky to get a hang of, but it's called a relative path. And to see if it's going to work here, you got to see when I'm hovering over it, you actually see the picture that I moved in there. You know it works if it is doing that. Like if I take out the slash and hover over it, you don't see a picture, nothing happens. So the slash is actually important. That's actually a folder, or what's called a directory on the web. So something that we'll continue to work on, but we got our image in there now, and we have one attribute. Now there's always a second attribute, so we can add a space and then an ALT and the equals quotes, and then just type in your name. Now this second attribute is alt text, and it essentially shows up if the image doesn't display or doesn't link properly, so the text actually shows up, or if somebody's blind or hard of vision, they actually have screen readers they use, or they might have the images turned off completely, so we can put descriptive text in the alternative text, the alt text, as an attribute for all of our images. So every image you ever create looks like this: IMG, SRC with the link to the image, and then an alt tag for alternative text. Okay. Now, we're going to put a couple links in here. So we're going to start with the top level link here. So we have an H1, and here's where we're going to kind of nest HTML tags inside of each other. So inside the H1, we can type in an A, and then a href is what it's called, is another attribute. And we're going to have it just linked to the same file we're working on. So it's essentially a home button. Now if we do that and we close that, and then I'm going to cut, so Apple X, and paste. So we have our A, and then attribute href with the value linking to the index file, so it links to itself. So when we click on our name, it goes to the home page. Okay, and then we have the little greater than sign, and then we want to make sure it's closed after my name, but before we close the H1. Okay, so it's inside the H1 and then around the name. Okay, so again, HTML elements, HTML attribute. Okay, attributes make the HTML elements do more than what they can by themselves. Okay, so now we're going to jump down and add a couple last things here, and then we'll kind of move on to some CSS and looking at pages. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to have you do this yourself, but the A href, I'm not going to really talk about it as I do it, but we are going to change the href to what's called a mail-to tag. Okay, so mail-to is going to say when they click on this link, it's going to open up an email client to let people email you. Okay, so we need to have mail-to, M-A-I-L-T-O, colon, no spaces or anything, and I'm just going to put my Hotmail account here. Okay, and same as what we did above, we're going to close it off and then make sure you have your closing tag around your name. So same kind of thing we just did a bit ago. We have a paragraph that's around our name, and then inside the paragraph we have the A href equals quotes, and then the value is mail-to, colon, and then whatever email you want to use, and then we close it right before the close of the paragraph. Okay, the last thing we're going to add in here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about paths, is we need a copyright symbol. Right, and this is kind of a little bit of a special character, if you will. It has an HTML code instead of a tag, but in between the paragraph and the link, we want to type in an ampersand, which is Shift-7, and then we want to type in copy. And you see that that's going to give us the copyright symbol, and we're going to put 2018, and then a space, and then we have our name with a link so people can email us. Okay? So we've added a link, we've added a copyright symbol, we've added the date, we've added another link at the top with our name, and we have our images. Now, let's say that we didn't want to link to our home page. We wanted to link off to like Google or something like that. This is every link we've put in here is what's called a relative link or relative path. So this is relative to the file we're working on, this is relative to the file we're working on. If we wanted our name to go to like our Facebook account or something like that, we would need to type in something called an absolute path, right? So these are relative paths we're using now. Absolute paths are links that actually go off to another website. And we have to actually type the absolute complete URL. So that includes http://www.facebook.com, right? And whatever you really want. So the value changes inside the attribute itself. So this is what's called a relative path because it's relative to the internal site we're working on. This is what's called an absolute path because it links off of a web page. Now you don't have to type that. I'm going to keep it as index.html. That's what we need it for. But that's going to kind of finish off the HTML. So in the next video, we're actually going to take a look at how we can preview this and test and see what we're typing actually looks like what we want it to.